The views and opinions expressed on the Nova Society are those of the panelists and guests and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of the Phoenix Research Institute or any institution which any panel member is associated. Reproduction or dissemination other than for the purpose of education or information without the express written permission of the Phoenix Research Institute or Nova Society Media is strictly prohibited.
I'd like to welcome everyone back to the Nova Society. I'm your host, Dr. Brooklyn Ann Weldon, and I'm here with my panel, Dr. Scott Gershwer and Dr. Mark Bound. Today we are joined by David Cay Johnston, who should be well known to many of you, and we are extremely excited and delighted to have Professor Johnston here as our guest. David Cay, please tell our listeners about you.
Well, I was for 58 years a journalist, primarily an investigative reporter at the New York Times, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the LA Times, the Detroit Free Press, and when I was 19 years old, a staff writer at the San Jose Mercury, now the sixth largest paper in America. I've written 8 books. 4 of them were national New York Times bestsellers. 2 of them were international bestsellers. 3 of those books are about Donald Trump, whom I have covered longer than anybody else since 1988, when I wrote about the prospect of him becoming president of the United States someday, 36 years ago. Over my career, I was the first journalist to seriously examine the Los Angeles Police Department. That was more than 40 years ago. I've exposed foreign agents, spies, oligarchs trying to steal money from charity, like Baron Hilton of the hotel chain, and a whole host of other subjects over that career. Since 2009, I have been a columnist for various publications and taught law at Syracuse University College of Law. I taught the law of the ancient world to third-year law students for 8 years and had a joint appointment in the business school. And then this fall, I became a full-time professor of practice, the first professor of practice at Rochester Institute of Technology, where I'm sort of an academic utility infielder. I'm teaching courses in public policy, criminology, journalism, and law.
Well, I feel like I've known you for a while because I've been reading. I'm a New York Times reader, and I've read all of your articles in there over the years. And you've
Thank you.
Done a great job, I think, of exposing the president-elect in some of his more compromised ways. I mostly think of you kind of as an economics writer. But I guess that's not actually.
Much of my career was writing about economic issues, very complex regulatory and tax issues. My Pulitzer Prize and the 3 times I was one of the 3 named finalists for a Pulitzer were for my coverage of the tax system. One of the Pulitzer juries described what it called my exquisite command of complex tax law. But I've also written about Black radicals, Latino radicals during the Vietnam War era, solved a number of crimes, including murders that the police failed to solve. So a broad career, exposed fraudulent books and news articles by corrupt journalists. And I'm the only journalist in American history who caused a broadcast chain, 6 TV and radio stations, to have to go out of business after I revealed what today we call fake news, but basically things that were said on the air that either weren't true or were designed to advance the business interests of the principal owner of this incredibly profitable company. Most companies report profit somewhere between 5 and 15% of revenues. This guy reported in some years 90% of his radio revenues as profit and 50% of his TV revenues as profit.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And history does rhyme.
Yes, it does. I have to admit, I don't really pay that much attention to national news. I'm more international. than I am national. But I
Sure.
did. I mean, I was kind of looking when Brooklyn invited you on. I said, wait a minute, this is the guy that was talking about Trump's finances.
Right.
And what a
Yeah,
mess. So I guess I'm going to ask a question from that. Knowing what you know about Trump's finances and what the reality is of it, why does the American people think that he's so good for the economy? Can you explain that to us?
Absolutely. Let's begin with this baseline observation. More than half of Americans, 54%, read at the level of a sixth grader or below. The median, half more, half less, is fifth grade reading level. And 22% of Americans, that's more than 1 in 5, read at the level of a third grader or below. Most households, if you exclude a Bible, never buy a book. Now, a nation full of people who have limited literacy skills also suggests, although I don't have any hard data on it, serious problems with innumeracy. And one of the lectures I give all over the world is how to reduce numbers to 1 so that people can understand them. You know, if you tell people billions and trillions of dollars, it doesn't mean anything. But if you can tell them it's 1 in 5 of your tax dollars goes for X, that may help them understand it. So Donald is a con artist. He has been a con artist his entire life. He is the 3rd generation head of a 4-generation white-collar crime family. So this is not like the mafia or the drug cartels. The Trumps don't break legs and kill people. They instead make promises they are not going to keep and don't keep. They lie to you. They falsify documents. They refuse to pay obligations and find ways to do it at a level that's small enough that it's not worth it for you to sue them for how they've harmed you. And Donald is, I've exposed many con artists since I started as a professional journalist when I was a teenager, 1966. So I worked for 2 weekly newspapers in Santa Cruz, California, weekly throwaway shopper papers. I've exposed many con artists over the years. Donald is in a league all by himself. He is the most masterful con artist I have ever seen. And because people don't know things, he can tell them that. And here's a couple of examples. Donald screams about crime. Crime in America is down substantially. It went up when he was in office. It's come down. Compared to the 1980s, crime is down overall by about 1/3. The one exception to that is that rape is higher, but that's because women weren't reporting rape in the 80s at the levels they are today because of the way the cops behaved. But murder, armed robbery, aggravated assault, the crimes that worry people, those are all down. And if you go back to the 80s, the 60s, or the 1920s, crime in America has come way, way, way down. Donald has persuaded people that inflation is completely out of control. Inflation is running below the post-World War II average. That's 3.5% a year. Currently, it's running 2.1% a year, and the Federal Reserve's goal is 2% inflation. So we're essentially there. And the inflation we did have was the result of the pandemic. Every other modern country in the world is far worse off today than the United States. The Economist magazine, a very sober business publication, did a cover story about how the American economy under Biden is the envy of the world. Real increases in wages. I just did an analysis this morning, I haven't published it yet, that the median wage in America last year, 2023, grew 20% faster than the average wage. For decades, the average wage has been pulling away from the median because of all the people who are very highly paid. 1 year under Trump, or immediately after Trump, 2021, there were over 500 people whose work paid them more than $100 million. The average was $156 million. And that's fallen back now to around 220, 210. So we've seen growth in the wages of people in the bottom half exceeding inflation and exceeding the rate of everybody as a whole. But people don't know that. And Donald is a masterful messenger, like all con artists. He knows how to appeal to what you want to hear and to reinforce what you want to hear. And he tests his messages. He'll say things and then realize this isn't working and he'll back away. So while Donald is appallingly ignorant, he claims to be the world's greatest expert on 22 subjects and to be the greatest expert of all time on tax policy, something for which I have a worldwide reputation. He doesn't know anything. When he went to Hawaii on his way to Japan, his first year in the White House, he had to have it explained to him why there is a memorial over the USS Arizona. I don't know how you can grow up in America and not know that December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in infamy, as FDR put it, what it was about. Donald didn't know that Finland is not part of Russia. And most importantly for a president, I don't expect most Americans to know the difference between Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims. But if you're the president of the United States, you damn well better know, because it's crucial. And if Donald was ever asked a question, if he could, some journalist could say, well, Mr. Trump, what's the difference between a Sunni and a Shia, and why does it matter to America? You'd hear a lot of gobbledygook.
I mean, we said in one of the, probably our last episode, a friend of mine wrote from Europe and said that the United States on the 5th of November took a combined IQ test and failed miserably. And how true he was onto that. So, I mean, with what you're saying, and I totally agree with it, is it the fact that Trump is that good a con artist, or is it the fact that the American people are just kind of that dumb?
Well, I don't think the American people are dumb. And by the way, my view of the November 5th election is that it was a character test, not of the candidates, but the American people, and we failed. Try to think of another world leader who is as, and I'm going to be redundant here, crass, vulgar, tasteless as Donald Trump. Idi Amin comes to mind, but I can't think of anybody else. There have been major economic changes in this country that play a big role in this. So Donald's support comes from three groups of people. The biggest group are the 90% of Americans whose incomes until Biden came along had peaked in 1973. When you adjust for inflation, in 2016, the bottom 90% of Americans only got paid through Thanksgiving. They went the last 4.5, 5 weeks with no income compared to 1973. Now, in 1973, if you had health care, and not everybody did, but large numbers of people did, especially those doing blue-collar work, it was on top of your wages. It was what we called a fringe benefit. Today, it comes out of your paycheck, some of it or all of it. That reduces your cash pay. The same thing is true of retirement. We used to have widely defined benefit pension plans that paid you a sum based on how many years and how much you made working for a company or other employer. Those have been replaced by and large by what are called defined contribution plans, where you take money out of your paycheck, put it into the plan with some additional match, typically 2% or 3% from your employer. And that further reduces your cash pay. So that by 2016, the bottom 90% of Americans on average only got paid till about October 20th. That means they went 10 weeks in a 52-week year with no income compared to their fathers or grandfathers or mothers or grandmothers. I wrote a best-selling series of books about this, explaining how this happened. Perfectly Legal, which won the Investigative Book of the Year award, Free Lunch, and Perfectly Legal was about taxes. Free Lunch, which was about these massive hidden subsidies to large corporations, and The Fine Print, which was about the suppression of competition and the rise of monopolies, duopolies, and triopolies. Those were bestsellers, but you know what? A couple 100,000 people bought the books. In a country of over 300 million people, bupkis. And I deliberately wrote them, by the way, so anybody who got through high school would be able to understand them. But nonetheless, most people don't know this. They don't think that way. It's not helpful. So that's the economic part. People feeling, why were my parents and my grandparents better off than I am? The second element is people who do not embrace the various civil rights movements. The classic civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the gender movement. And it appeared in America that we had made great progress since the end of World War II. Donald came along and just peeled off what turns out to be a veneer, exposing the ugliness of what was beneath. There are millions of Americans who do not want to sit next to an Asian on the airplane. They do not want to have a Latino in the cockpit flying the plane, and God forbid they have to report to a Black woman boss. And that's the second group. The third group are what I call faux, F-A-U-X, fake, faux Christians. These are people who believe in hatred, in turning away people, in punishing people if they don't have money. And you can watch them on TV. I've spent hours and hours watching these people through their preachers. They promote things that are 100% antithetical to what is in the Bible, both the New Testament and Old. Just today, there's an email I get every day about the history of racial injustice, and it's about how a town in Mississippi, I think it was Mississippi, it might have been Alabama, forced a white minister and a white pastor to leave under the implicit threat of death because they were helping Black people. They allowed white and Black teenagers to swim in the same pond. And this was so offensive that they couldn't deal with it. Glenn Loury, the economist who is now professor emeritus at Brown University, one of the Ivy Leagues, he just did a video about being stopped by the cops who treated him as a criminal, dangerous threat with, hand on the holster, etc. He's 76 years old, wearing a suit and carrying a briefcase, but he's seen as a thug by many cops. So you take these three groups and do a Venn diagram. There's a huge overlap. The bottom 90% of people, not everybody there is pro-Trump, but it's a huge group for him to draw from. The fake Christians, and then the people who want to make America white again. That's Donald's support base. And then you throw in very self-interested, very wealthy people who only care about their tax cuts. And I've interviewed, by the way, some very wealthy Black business owners who are pro-Trump. And when I ask him, how can the guy's a complete racist? His family is full of racism. And the answer I get is very cynical. They're all racists, meaning white people, politicians. They're all racists, and he's going to get me a tax cut. So people are not dumb. If you walk into a blue-collar bar somewhere, and which has a baseball game on, and there's a controversial play by the umpire, a potential call by the umpire about a play, you will see people dissect that action in fine detail. They deeply understand the rules of professional, or as I prefer to call them, commercial sports. They're just not interested in politics. It isn't part of their lives. They don't understand public policy, which is not inherently easy to understand. And here's someone who says, vote for me and I'm going to make your life better. And they went for it.
The only issue that I have with all that is that there are still people who should know better about what the results were last time. I mean, it didn't end well for Donald Trump in America, yet they persist in believing that that things were better 4 years ago than they are now.
Well, that's because most of us, our awareness is not based on the data that shows the reality of what happened. It's based on our experience. And very few people think that they're paid what they ought to be paid. And almost everybody now lives in terror of losing their job. I mean, even tenured university professors don't have tenure in the economic sense anymore. We've seen a lot of tenured professors fired. And this fear, I'll lose my job and I'm living paycheck to paycheck, is a crucial part of that. Now, you then can point out to people, and I've done this with some folks, wait a minute, you're complaining you don't have any money. I'm looking at that pickup truck. You don't do a job that requires you to carry stuff around. And what did that thing cost you? $72,000 for a pickup truck that's a gas hog? And didn't you just mention to me that you took your 3 kids and your wife to Orlando for a long weekend vacation? I mean, the connection between reality and the facts is often very emotional. And there's one way to think about it. I'm sure you've known many men and many women in the course of your life who had a contentious relationship with somebody awful, and they kept going back to them. So
we're like all abused wives, housewives.
Yeah, well, it's sort of like being a New York Giants fan. We just keep going back. I mean, no matter how
or a
bad
Cubs
they are.
fan if you live in Chicago.
Or a Cubs fan. That's absolutely. We will continue this conversation with Professor Johnston in our next episode. We hope you join us. So that's all the time we have for today's episode. The Nova Society is a production of the Phoenix Research Institute. We'd like to thank our sponsor for this episode, the Journal of Interdisciplinary Conflict Science. The JCIS is an open journal for upcoming scholars. The JCIS is currently accepting article submissions on an ongoing basis. The JCIS is a publication of Nova Works, a scholarly depository at Nova Southeastern University. A link to the journal is in our description. We'd also like to thank our podcast partners, Buzzsprout, who hosts the Nova Society, Audacity, who is our editing partner, and Podkite, who does all of our analytics. We'd also like to thank iHeart Radio, where people get their music and podcasts, Apple iTunes, the largest source for music and podcasts on the internet, Spotify, the most popular source for the Nova Society. The Nova Society is available on all these and other quality platforms mentioned in our description. We'd also like to thank our listeners. Without you, the Nova Society would not be possible. If you have a comment, a question, or would like to be a guest on the Nova Society, we can be reached at nova.society.podcast@gmail.com. Always remember, the power of society is knowledge. So for Dr. Scott Gershwer, Dr. Brooklyn Ann Weldon, Dr. Priscilla Hobbs, and all of us here at the Nova Society, I'm Dr. Mark Bound. Be well, and we hope to see you again next time.